Marcus Peterson had lived in his suburban Maple Ridge home for nearly 15 years. The modest two-story house with its spacious backyard had been the perfect place to raise his two children, Emma and Jason. This summer, with Emma heading to college in the fall and Jason more interested in basketball than swimming, Marcus decided it was finally time to dismantle the above-ground pool that had been a fixture in his backyard for over a decade. On a warm Saturday morning in June, Marcus stood in his yard surveying the 24-foot round pool. Memories flooded back as he recalled installing it when the kids were just 7 and 9. Back then, the neighborhood had been different. More families, more community barbecues, more children splashing and laughing during those hot summer months. Marcus smiled, remembering Emma learning to swim, Jason's cannonball competitions with the neighbors' kids, and his wife Sarah's floating yoga sessions before she passed away 3 years ago from cancer. "It's just a pool," Marcus muttered to himself, trying to be practical. The maintenance had become increasingly time-consuming, checking chlorine levels, replacing the pump last season, patching the liner twice. Not to mention his water bill had steadily climbed as the aging system became less efficient. With both kids pursuing other interests, the pool had sat mostly unused for the past 2 summers. Marcus had done his homework. He'd researched proper pool removal procedures, visited the city's website to review regulations about water drainage, and even called the waste management facility to confirm disposal methods for the various materials. He printed out all the guidelines and created a meticulous checklist that now sat on his patio table, weighted down the coffee mug. At 8:30 a.m., he began by connecting a long hose to the pool's drainage valve, directing the water toward the storm drain at the street's edge as permitted by local regulations. The process would take hours, but Marcus was in no rush. He set up a lawn chair nearby and pulled out a dog-eared paperback he'd been meaning to finish. By early afternoon, with the water level significantly reduced, Marcus's longtime friend and neighbor, Ray, wandered over from 2 doors down. "The end of an era, huh?" Ray said, handing Marcus a cold beer. "Yeah, time marches on," Marcus replied, accepting the drink gratefully. "Want to help me remove some of these deck boards tomorrow? I could use an extra set of hands." "Count me in," Ray nodded, surveying the pool. "Remember when Jason jumped in fully clothed at his 10th birthday party? Sarah was so mad at first, then ended up joining them." Marcus laughed, the memory bittersweet. She always did know how to turn frustration into fun. As the afternoon progressed, Marcus carefully sorted materials into piles. Metal components that could be recycled, the vinyl liner that needed special disposal, and wooden deck materials that could be repurposed. He took photos of each step, partly for nostalgia and partly to document his compliance with disposal regulations. The dismantling would take the entire weekend, probably next weekend too, but Marcus felt good about the decision. It was time for a change, perhaps a vegetable garden in this spot, something Sarah had always wanted to try. What Marcus didn't notice as he worked was the new neighbor 3 houses down, watching intently from behind her kitchen curtains, phone in hand, occasionally taking photos of his activities with a disapproving frown. By Sunday afternoon, Marcus had made significant progress on the pool dismantling. The water was completely drained, and he and Ray had removed about half of the wooden decks surrounding the pool. They worked methodically, with Marcus's playlist of 80s rock providing the soundtrack to their labor. The vinyl liner lay partially removed, its once blue surface now faded and worn after years of chlorine and sun exposure. As Marcus bent down to detach another section of liner, the hair on the back of his neck stood up, that distinct feeling of being watched. He turned toward his left fence line and spotted a woman with perfectly highlighted blonde hair peering over the wooden slats, her expression a mixture of scrutiny and displeasure. "Good afternoon," Marcus called out, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. "You must be Diane, right? I don't think we formally met. I'm Marcus Peterson." Diane Parker had moved into the colonial-style house 3 doors down approximately 6 months ago, following her divorce from a corporate attorney in the city. At the neighborhood's annual spring potluck, she had introduced herself as a former HOA president from her previous suburban community. Though Maple Ridge had no formal homeowners association, Diane had quickly positioned herself as an unofficial neighborhood watchdog, commenting on everything from lawn maintenance schedules to appropriate holiday decoration timelines. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, ignoring his introduction, her voice carrying a sharp edge that seemed at odds with a pleasant Sunday afternoon. Her manicured fingers clutched her phone, which she raised occasionally to capture images of Marcus's backyard project. "Just taking down the old pool," Marcus replied, maintaining his friendly tone despite her obvious disapproval. "It's seen better days, and no one really uses it anymore." "You got a permit for this?" Diane asked, her eyes narrowing as she took another photo. "There are codes and regulations about these things. Pools can be very dangerous, even when being removed." Ray, overhearing the exchange, rolled his eyes behind Diane's sightline. He mouthed seriously to Marcus, who subtly shook his head, signaling his friend not to escalate the situation. Actually, I checked with the city, Marcus explained patiently. For an above-ground pool of this type, no special demolition permit is required. I just need to follow the disposal guidelines, which I printed out right over there. He gestured toward his checklist on the patio table. Diane's lips thinned to a straight line. Well, I certainly hope you're disposing of the chemicals properly, and that liner should be handled as hazardous material. I assume you're aware that improper disposal carries significant fines. Before Marcus could respond that yes, he was aware and had already arranged for proper disposal, Diane snapped several more photos, particularly focusing on the pile of dismantled deck boards and the partially removed liner. I'll be keeping an eye on this situation, she announced, as if bestowing a favor upon him. The neighborhood has standards, after all. Marcus waved politely, forcing a smile. Feel free to stop by any time if you have concerns. I'm happy to walk you through the process. But Diane had already retreated, disappearing behind her fence without acknowledging his offer. Through a gap in the fence boards, Marcus could see her rapidly typing on her phone as she walked back toward her house. Well, she seems delightful, Ray muttered, picking up his hammer again. Want you to accidentally splash some pool water her direction next time? Marcus laughed despite his unease. Let's just finish this up. Some people just need to feel important, I guess. As they returned to work, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that Diane's interest in his pool removal wasn't merely neighborly concern, but something more problematic. Still, he dismissed the thought. What could possibly go wrong with taking down his own pool on his own property? Wednesday afternoon found Marcus returning home from his job as an architectural designer at a local firm. The past few days had been busy but productive. The pool was now completely dismantled, with the metal frame neatly stacked in his garage awaiting a weekend trip to the recycling center. The liner was properly bagged according to regulations, and the wooden decking had been cleaned and stored behind his shed for a future garden project. As Marcus pulled into his driveway, he noticed something on his front door, a bright orange paper that stood out starkly against the navy blue paint. Frowning, he parked and approached his house, retrieving the paper that had been firmly secured with official-looking tape. Notice of violation read the bold header from the City of Maple Ridge Code Enforcement Division. Marcus's eyes widened as he scanned the document. According to the citation, he was being fined $750 for unauthorized pool removal without proper permits and an additional $500 for improper disposal of hazardous pool materials. The notice referenced a complaint submitted by a concerned citizen with photographic evidence of code violations. This has to be a mistake, Marcus muttered, reading through the document a second time. The citation detailed allegations that he had drained chlorinated water directly into the storm sewer. False, he had tested the water beforehand and followed drainage guidelines, disposed of chemical containers improperly. False, he had carefully saved all containers for hazardous waste disposal and created an attractive nuisance by leaving pool equipment unsecured. False, everything had been organized and stored appropriately each evening. Inside the house, Marcus immediately called the number listed on the citation. After navigating an automated menu system and waiting on hold for 17 minutes, he finally reached a clerk named Patricia in the code enforcement office. I'm looking at a citation that makes no sense, Marcus explained, struggling to keep frustration from his voice. I've been meticulous about following regulations for my pool removal. Let me look up the case, Patricia said, the sound of keyboard clicks coming through the phone. Yes, Mr. Peterson, we received a complaint on Sunday evening with substantial photographic evidence. The complainant indicated they had observed violations over the course of the weekend. But that's impossible, Marcus insisted. I researched all the regulations beforehand. I printed them out and followed them to the letter. According to our records, Patricia continued, her voice taking on a practiced neutrality, above-ground pools over a certain size require a demolition permit, which was not obtained. Marcus ran his hand through his hair in frustration. That's not what your website says. I specifically checked. Well, sir, the evidence suggests otherwise. The photographs show what appears to be improper handling of the liner and chemicals. As the conversation continued, Marcus realized what had happened. Diane had selectively photographed moments during the dismantling process that, taken out of context, could be misinterpreted as violations. A photo of the liner temporarily placed on the grass while he adjusted his work area. A picture of pool chemicals in their original containers, waiting to be transported to the hazardous waste facility. Can I see these photos? And who filed this complaint? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. The complainant's information is confidential, Mr. Peterson, but I can email you copies of the submitted evidence. You do have the right to appeal the citation within 10 business days. After hanging up, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, staring at the citation in disbelief. The fine totaled $1,250, money he had been saving for Emma's college textbooks. More than the financial hit, though, was the injustice of it all. He had done everything by the book, yet here he was being penalized as if he were some irresponsible homeowner. His phone pinged with an email notification. The promised photographs from the code enforcement office had arrived. As Marcus opened the attachment and began scrolling through the images, his confusion turned to anger. These were definitely taken from Diane's yard, and they definitely did not tell the whole story. Thursday morning, Marcus called into work to use a personal day. This situation demanded his full attention. After a restless night reviewing the citation and the misleading photographs, he was determined to clear his name and avoid the hefty fine that would put a dent in Emma's college fund. His first stop was City Hall, a red brick colonial building in downtown Maple Ridge. The code enforcement office was tucked away in the basement, a fluorescent-lit room with beige walls and outdated furniture. Marcus approached the counter with his folder of documentation. "I'd like to speak with someone about this citation," he said, sliding the orange notice across the counter to a middle-aged woman whose nameplate read Patricia Wilson. Recognition flickered in her eyes. "Mr. Peterson, we spoke yesterday. I understand your frustration, but—" "I'm not just frustrated," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm but controlled. "I'm being falsely accused. I have documentation proving I've followed all regulations." He opened his folder, revealing printed guidelines from the city website, date-stamped photos of his own showing the proper handling procedures, and detailed notes he had made throughout the process. Patricia examined his materials with genuine interest. "This is quite thorough, Mr. Peterson. However, the complaint filed against you was also very specific." "I'd like to see all the evidence submitted," Marcus requested. "And I'd like to know what permit I supposedly needed because according to this," he pointed to a printed page from the city's website. "Above-ground pools under 30 inches deep don't require demolition permits, just proper disposal procedures." Patricia's brow furrowed as she examined the printout. "Let me check something," she said, turning to her computer. After several minutes of typing and clicking, she looked up. "There seems to be some inconsistency between our internal guidelines and the public information." "Meaning?" Marcus asked. "Meaning you might have a valid case for appeal." She hesitated. "I'll email you the complete file of submitted evidence. As for the complainant, I know who it was," Marcus assured her. "My neighbor, Diane Parker. What I don't understand is why the city would act on a complaint without verifying the regulations." Patricia lowered her voice. "Between us, Mr. Peterson, we've received 17 complaints from Ms. Parker in the 6 months she's lived here. Most were dismissed, but this one had such detailed documentation." Marcus thanked Patricia and left with a clearer understanding of the situation and a scheduled appeal hearing for the following Tuesday. His next stop was the public library, where he spent 2 hours researching city codes related to pools and demolition. What he discovered was enlightening. The city had updated its website 3 months ago, but some internal documents still reference outdated regulations. That afternoon, he drove to his neighbor Ray's house. Ray, a retired building inspector, would understand the nuances of code enforcement better than anyone. "These photos are completely misleading," Ray said, examining the evidence on Marcus' tablet. "This one shows the liner on the grass, but it's clearly just temporary placement. And look, in the background, you can see the proper disposal bags ready to go." "Exactly," Marcus agreed. She deliberately waited for moments that could be misinterpreted. "What's her endgame here?" Ray wondered aloud. "Why target you specifically?" The question lingered as Marcus returned home. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed Elena Rodriguez, his next-door neighbor of 12 years, waving from her yard. "Marcus, do you have a minute?" she called. "I saw that citation on your door yesterday. You're not the only one dealing with Diane's complaints." Marcus walked over, curious. "What do you mean?" Elena's expression was a mixture of annoyance and concern. "She's been on a crusade since she moved in. Filed a complaint about my garden gnomes being tacky, reported the Thompsons for their fence height. And get this," she lowered her voice, "she installed that fancy water feature in her backyard last month without any permits at all. I know because my cousin works for the contractor, and he mentioned they usually pull permits for installations like that." As Elena continued sharing neighborhood stories about Diane, pieces started falling into place for Marcus. This wasn't just about his pool, it was about power, control, and a woman who seemed determined to remake the neighborhood in her image, regardless of the rules she claimed to champion. By Friday evening, the news of Marcus's citation had spread throughout Maple Ridge. Elena, true to her nature as the neighborhood's unofficial communications hub, had mentioned it to a few key residents who had their own stories about Diane Parker. What began as isolated incidents suddenly formed a pattern when viewed collectively. Marcus's phone rang just after dinner. It was Barbara Thompson, whose colonial-style home sat across the street. "Marcus, I just heard about what happened with your pool," Barbara said, her normally cheerful voice tinged with indignation. "That woman reported us 2 months ago for our fence height." We had to pay a surveyor $450 to prove it was within regulations. Similar calls followed. Jim and Sarah Lawson had received a warning about the recycling bins being visible from the street. The Garcias had been reported for their children's basketball hoop. Even Mrs. Wilson, the 82-year-old widow who had lived on the corner for decades, had received a citation for her excessive bird feeders, creating a nuisance wildlife situation. Marcus began taking notes, documenting dates, nature of complaints, and outcomes. A disturbing picture emerged. Diane had systematically targeted nearly half the households in their section of Maple Ridge, often using misleading photographs as evidence. "We should do something," Ray suggested when Marcus called to update him. "This isn't just about you anymore." By Saturday morning, Marcus's kitchen had become command central. 8 neighbors gathered around his table, sharing stories over coffee and Alina's homemade conchas. Marcus had taped a neighborhood map to his refrigerator, marking houses that had received complaints with red dots. The visual impact was striking, a cluster of red concentrated around Diane's home. "She's working her way around her immediate vicinity," observed Tom Garcia, studying the map, "like she's establishing territory. The question is why," Barbara said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "What does she gain from all this?" Alina's cousin Miguel, who worked for Blue Ridge Landscaping, had brought another crucial piece of evidence, a copy of the work order for Diane's water feature installation. The elegant limestone fountain and surrounding pond had been installed 6 weeks ago with a clear notation. "Client declined permit application service will handle permits independently." "She never filed for those permits," Miguel confirmed. "My boss usually includes permit fees in the quote, but she insisted on handling that part herself. He assumed she just wanted to save on our service fee. So she's reporting everyone else while ignoring regulations herself," Marcus said, the irony not lost on anyone in the room. As the group discussed strategy for the upcoming appeal hearing, 16-year-old Jason walked in from baseball practice, stopping short when he saw the gathered neighbors. "What's happening?" "Is this about that mean lady and her complaints?" he asked, dropping his equipment bag. "News travels fast," Marcus said with a small smile. "Dad, she's been taking pictures of other kids too," Jason said, his expression serious beyond his years. "Megan from down the street said Mrs. Parker photographed her and her friends when they were washing cars in the driveway last weekend. Said they were wasting water and threatened to report them." Uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Adults exchanging photographs of property was one thing, taking pictures of minors without parental consent was another matter entirely. "I think we need to expand our approach," said Alina, her teacher's instinct for protecting children evident in her voice. "This isn't just about permits and citations anymore." By the time the neighbors departed that afternoon, they had formed the Maple Ridge Community Action Committee. Their mission extended beyond Marcus' appeal. They would advocate for clearer code enforcement procedures, establish a neighborhood support network, and most importantly, ensure that no resident could weaponize city regulations against their neighbors. As Marcus closed the door behind the last neighbor, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's passing: the strength of community of people united by shared purpose. What Diane had intended as isolation had instead created connection. Tuesday evening arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that typically would have found Marcus relaxing on his back patio. Instead, he stood before the mirror in his bedroom, adjusting his tie, a navy blue one Emma had given him last Father's Day. He had opted for his charcoal suit, the one he usually reserved for client presentations. Tonight's appeal hearing before the city council warranted the formality. "You look like you're going to court," Jason commented from the doorway. "In a way I am," Marcus replied. "First impressions matter." He gathered his meticulously organized portfolio, property records, dated photographs of the pool removal process, printouts of the city regulations, disposal receipts, and statements from 6 neighbors documenting Diane's pattern of complaints. Ray had helped him prepare a concise 3-minute statement for the public comment portion of the meeting. At 6:45 p.m., Marcus arrived at Maple Ridge City Hall, surprised to find the parking lot unusually full for a routine council meeting. As he entered the wood-paneled chamber, he understood why. Nearly 20 of his neighbors were already seated, many nodding in recognition as he walked in. Elena waved him over to a saved seat in the second row. "We figured you could use some moral support," she whispered as he settled beside her. "I didn't expect everyone to come," Marcus said, genuinely moved by the turnout. "Are you kidding? This has become the neighborhood's cause caliber," Ray said from his seat behind them. Mayor Richardson called the meeting to order at 7:00 p.m. sharp. After dispensing with routine business, they reached the appeals portion of the agenda. Marcus was the second case to be heard. "Mr. Peterson is appealing citations for code violations related to pool removal at 247 Oakwood Drive," the city clerk announced. "Mr. Peterson, you have 3 minutes for your statement." Marcus approached the podium, placed his notes before him, and took a steady breath. Mayor Richardson, council members, thank you for your time this evening. He began his architectural training, giving his voice a natural projection. I'm here to appeal citations issued based on misleading evidence and outdated regulations. He methodically presented his case, emphasizing his research before beginning the project, his documentation throughout, and the conflicting information between the city website and internal guidelines. I respectfully request that these citations be dismissed based on the evidence I've provided. Marcus concluded exactly at the 3-minute mark. Councilwoman Jenkins leaned forward. Mr. Peterson, these photographs submitted with the complaint seem to show improper handling of pool materials. Can you address this? Yes, Councilwoman, Marcus replied, opening his portfolio. I brought my own timestamp photographs that show the complete process, not just selectively captured moments. You'll note that what appears to be improper disposal in the complaint photos was actually temporary placement during the organized dismantling process. As the council members examined his evidence, the chamber doors opened. Diane Parker strode in, dressed in a tailored pantsuit, her expression faltering momentarily at the sigh.